Well, g'day and welcome to the Climate Security Podcast. My name is Michael Thomas with the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, and today we have special guest Rhys Kissel. Rhys is a systems engineer with Adroita. He spent 4 years in the Royal Australian Navy as a weapons electrical engineering officer and has worked for a wide variety of other organisations, including Boeing, and as a motorsport engineer with Team Arrow, and also as a volunteer at Engineers Without Borders. In late 2023, Rhys presented and published his paper, The Effects of Climate Change on Ocean Hydroacoustics and Sonar at the Indo-Pacific International Maritime Exposition. Rhys, welcome to the Climate Security Podcast.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be on.
Rhys, I'd just like to begin. Can you please provide the listeners with a little more on your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I initially went to university to study computer and software engineering. And in my first year of university, an opportunity came up for a bit of engineering in the field with Engineers Without Borders. So they run a program where they take university students to developing communities. So that could take you to places like Nepal, India, Cambodia, Vanuatu, and so on. In my case, I went to Cambodia with them, and we spent some time in a remote community on an island in the middle of the Mekong River, about 6 or 7 hours north of the capital, Phnom Penh. Now, spending time in that community, which is made up mostly of subsistence farmers who were removed from the often bad faith discussions about climate change in the West, it became really evident to me that climate change was a real existential threat for them. As a really concrete example, they no longer knew when to sow or harvest their fields, which directly impacts their yields, and their yields are not only their income, but it's also what they actually have to eat at the end of the day. So this is when I first became professionally interested in climate change. Later on, I would join the Royal Australian Navy's undergraduate entry program, continuing a family history of service in the ADF. And by this time, I'd changed my major to electrical engineering, intending to focus on renewable power someday, but this is the path I went down instead. And I spent some time working at a few Navy engineering bureaus and interacting with system program officers, and later after discharging, I moved home to Brisbane and began work with Boeing, as you mentioned, on one of their air defense surveillance programs. I also joined Team Arrow Solar Racing at the same time as I started at Boeing. That was a bit of an overlap with my interest in climate change and my technical skills. And since then, I've relocated to Canberra, and I now work with Adroita, providing technical services to the Department of Defence.
Yeah, thanks, Rhys. What an interesting background. I had the chance last year actually to go to Vietnam and spend some time on the Mekong Delta. So I can appreciate, that sort of on-ground experience and how it can lead to sort of, I guess just getting those perspectives. Interestingly enough, climate impacts on oceans can often play a second fiddle to what's occurring on land. And I guess I sort of think about, marine heat waves are a good example where they get, a fraction of the attention that they say, say, for example, land heat waves get. How did you become interested in this line of research, and why do you see it's important?
Yeah, totally. So after my trip to Cambodia, I changed majors to electrical engineering, and one of the streams of electrical engineering that was on offer at my university is what's called signals, or perhaps more commonly known as telecommunications. But the term signals is a bit more broad than that. It refers most famously to looking at radio waves and microwave frequencies and things like that. But it can refer to anything that can be described as a wave in a physics classroom. So that actually includes sound. I've always really enjoyed music. And one of the things I loved, even before going to university, was learning about musical synthesizers and how electronic music is made, more so the technical electronic side of it. And that interest really carried along with me all throughout university. And I eventually ended up settling on a thesis which would focus on acoustics, but specifically hydroacoustics. So when I first picked this topic in 2019, I had no idea that it had not really been meaningfully covered in scientific literature at all. But during my initial literature review and realizing how young and immature this particular field was, and that it would be literally state-of-the-art research, I knew I had to do it. So as for why it's important, the ocean is great at preventing the transmission of information in most forms from A to B. It's great from stopping light from penetrating it. You don't have to go too far down before it becomes really dark. And the only radio frequencies that can meaningfully penetrate deeply into seawater are ones that require antennas that are literally kilometers long and require absolutely immense amounts of power. But the ocean is great for transmitting sound. That's why marine wildlife like whales, dolphins, shrimp, they're also reliant on sound, and why naval platforms use sonar. So if the physical properties of ocean water are changing, and we know that they are, then that has knock-on effects for transmitting information in the ocean. And this is a big deal for Navy ships, marine wildlife, and civilian vessels, both commercial and scientific.
Often, gaps in research clearly, are uncovered during that literature review stage. So it would have been interesting when you were undertaking that. I'd imagine there's a whole breadth, a number of different areas in this, particular research area that, these sort of opportunities open themselves to. So, yeah, really good that you've were able to sort of spot this one and land in on it, because when you presented the paper at the Maritime Expo, it certainly got a lot of attention. And I'd just be interested if you could provide the listener with a brief overview of the key objectives and findings of your particular study.
Yeah, so the short version of it is that my objective was not actually to determine whether climate change would affect underwater sound. We already know that it will. We can infer that from basic physical principles. My objective was to determine how much it will affect underwater sound, and as well as encouraging further research on this topic by hopefully providing a bit of foundation for future researchers. So I found that in general, all sound will travel further by the year 2100 than it does today. And this effect is much more pronounced with higher acoustic frequencies or higher pitched noises, but it's still really prominent even in low frequencies. So as an example, let's say we've got one of our future frigates on patrol in the scenario I ran in my simulator, and we'll say it's 100 kilometers northeast of Cooktown in Queensland. So the Hunter-class frigate receives word that an enemy submarine's in the area, and it pings its sonar. In this scenario, that sonar is operating at 3,500 hertz. That's just an arbitrary frequency, but it should be suitable for locating a submarine. And we'll say it's also operating at 220 decibels, so it's very loud. The background noise is pretty high in this scenario as well. We're near the reef. We've got various species of shrimp making all sorts of noise. We've got other ships in the flotilla as well. And we're also moving at full speed. So we'll tell the simulator it's 170 decibels of background noise. Now, under conditions recorded by a robot in this location in early November last year, that sonar ping would get quieter and quieter until it was the same loudness as the background noise at about 28.5 kilometers away from the ship. So that loudness versus the background noise is what we call the signal to noise ratio, and it reaches zero at 28.5 kilometers under today's conditions. In 2100, that whole same scenario, the same frequency, loudness, and background noise level, that sonar ping will travel 37.5 kilometers before it became the same loudness as the background noise. So that's 9 kilometers further, about a 32% increase in the distance that sound will travel. And because the sound is emanated in all directions, we're going to cover about a 73% greater area in the ocean. And with this same methodology, the simulator helped me to find that frequencies suitable for hydrographic surveying travel between 10 and 26% further. And those used for mine hunting will travel up to 87% further.
Basically, that's amazing findings, and the mind boggles with, the applications for this. And you can really appreciate, you don't have to sort of think too hard that there would be a lot of industries, military, commercial, scientific, that would be really interesting in your findings. Can you just expand on that a little bit, and I suppose just go into, what some of those implications might be for the various sectors?
Yeah. So with underwater sound experiencing less attenuation or less fading over distance, it could really change the subsurface warfare paradigm for navies around the world. So in the open ocean, sound will travel much further, but in shallow coastal areas and archipelagos, the sound bouncing around for much longer than it does today may actually dramatically increase background noise. So there's really probably a lot to be said for naval operations and how it's going to affect them. More generally, for scientific purposes, it could mean mapping the seafloor in deeper areas is actually a lot easier than it is today. So this could be useful for finding resources below the ocean floor. And it could also mean that hydrographic maps have a better resolution in the future. As far as civilian and commercial purposes go, it could mean that fish finders become a lot more effective at sea, but are potentially also less effective in coastal areas because of that increase in background noise. Now, as I said, there's really a lot to say for the Navy, but I'm not a maritime warfare specialist. But my perspective, based on these findings, is that it will be much harder for subsurface platforms to hide in the open ocean. And it might actually become easier for them to hide in coastal areas, at least acoustically. So this could potentially have a really major effect on submarine operations in the future. It might even become untenable for crewed submarines to spend time in the open ocean. They may only be there for transits. And this could actually mean that there's consequences for the subsea nuclear deterrent that nations like the US and the UK utilize. And it could mean that nations begin to preference using unmanned subsea platforms in the open ocean, saving their crews from missions requiring special finesse, like navigating shallow areas or even entering the ports of adversaries. I'd really be interested to hear the ideas of others on this.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Reese. And of course, all this cuts both ways, doesn't it? So, for countries as they're trying to grapple with climate change, particularly from a security and a military perspective, that's why I think this is of such interest. And a lot of the attention, to date, from a climate security perspective, has been on the general impacts from a security perspective. But some of these, specific changes particularly to the marine environment, really just, hasn't really drilled down into great detail yet. So, yeah, kudos to your work that you've done in this space. It's certainly going to get a lot of interest. Could you talk to the listener or walk the listener through some of the more technical elements of your paper? So, one of the things that jumped out to myself was the simulator that you used in your study. What were the key challenges and decisions involved in its creation?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. So the simulator is written in an application called MATLAB. And it utilizes data from the International Argo program. So that program is a joint venture between a lot of the world's scientific and meteorological agencies. And basically what it is a cooperative venture to maintain a fleet of thousands of autonomous data collection robots in the ocean. So I took the data provided by these robots and I applied the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have projections for 2100, and I applied those projections to the data to see what the future of underwater sound might look like. Now, there were some challenges in that the IPCC has limited data on projections for the world's oceans in the future, especially the deep ocean in particular. This meant that I had to make some assumptions and some simplifications. For example, the model assumes that the increase in ocean surface temperature will be distributed throughout the whole water column. Now, this isn't necessarily accurate, but it still provides us with a fairly useful model for the first 500 meters down in the ocean, which is quite useful for examining the effects on naval platforms and marine wildlife, as well as activity near to the coast.
Yeah, thanks, Reese. And not to get too deep, but on the technical side of things, but your paper discusses two signal attenuation models. Can you explain what this means and how these models operate and what factors they take into account in predicting hydroacoustic signal propagation?
Yep. So the two models used in my simulator are the sonar equation and a model for determining the amount of transmission loss over a given distance. So the sonar equation basically gives us a signal to noise ratio, which is how many times louder a noise is than the background noise in a given location. That Hunter class submarine hunting scenario I gave earlier was an example of that. It's a pretty simple equation. But we take the loudness of the sound source, in this case a sonar, then we deduct transmission loss from it. And then from that figure, we deduct the difference between the background noise and a thing called the directivity index. And in the simulator, this is a static value because I only looked at active sonar transmissions. But if you wanted a more specialized model, you could change that and look at other types of sonar activity like passive and hydrophone arrays. The transmission loss over distance is a much more complicated equation. So this is where we get the value for transmission loss in the sonar equation. And I won't read this one out because it'll basically be gibberish to most of the audience, but it takes a frequency. It takes some chemical characteristics such as salinity, acidity, the presence of two chemicals in the ocean, which are boric acid and magnesium sulfate. And then it takes the physical characteristics like the temperature, the shear and bulk viscosities of seawater, and the pressure, which is mostly a function of depth in the ocean. It takes all of those values in the simulator for every depth in the ocean at 1 meter intervals. And this would basically mean if we were going to run a simulation in an Olympic pool that was 50 meters long and 2 meters deep, we'd calculate 100 transmission loss values. That'd be for one for each meter squared of a cross section of the pool.
Yeah, thanks, Reese. And probably, touching on some of the, I suppose, challenges and limitations. If we can go back to the Argo floats, for example, the scarcity of pH data you mentioned in the paper poses challenges. How did you address these challenges in your study, and what insights did you gain from the available data?
Yeah, so this was actually quite a tricky problem for the simulator. It meant that I basically had to perform quality assurance on the available data by hand, which was really a labor-intensive task. I would run a simulation, and on the hardware I have, for an ocean that's 3 kilometers deep and a sonar ping that could be traveling over 100 kilometers in some instances, there's a lot of calculations to run. And in some cases, it would actually take up to an hour for some of the simulations to run in the Arctic Ocean because sound will travel so far. And not only that, but the changes there are most prominent from climate change. So these were generally simulations of quite a bit of interest. And then sometimes the data at the end of the simulation would reveal that it was just total junk. You can look at the data you have before you run the simulation and make an educated guess as to whether it'll be good or not. But sometimes it's a bit up in the air. And you'd occasionally get to the end of a simulation that you expected to be good, and then you'd look at all the characteristics of it, and some of them just couldn't physically exist, or the acidity of the water would increase by 100 times in the span of a few meters. Just things that make absolutely no sense. Mm-hmm. And these characteristics change the density of water, so sound will just bounce off that more dense water below it or above it, like almost as if there's a giant pane of glass in the middle of the ocean. So identifying simulation results that were problematic was really easy, but it just wouldn't be evident until the simulation had completed. But as for the insights gained from the data that did work and which had no issues with them, I'd say that the main insight I've taken away from this is that I haven't actually been able to fully capture the scope of the problem. In fact, I am quite convinced that it's actually more severe than what I've been able to present with the available data.
Really, really interesting. And, it's that old sort of adage that, opening up one can of research worms leads to another. Thinking through as well, often, models are only as good as obviously, what you feed into them. What are the main trade-offs in, I suppose, in using these simplified models, and how do they impact the accuracy of your predictions?
That's a good question. So there's an old saying in science: all models are inaccurate, but some models are useful. And I would say that's very much the case here too. There is definitely a trade-off in the potential accuracy of the data in terms of how sound propagation will change, especially in the deep ocean versus near the surface. So the data made available by the IPCC mostly relates to changes at the surface. And the Argo program, those measurements typically only go down to a depth of 2,000 meters. So I would say, generally speaking, the simulator is going to be pretty accurate when looking close to the surface, but the deeper you go, and especially if you're looking below 2 kilometers, I would say the results start to become more of a suggestion than perhaps a highly accurate model. But I think it is fair to say that the simplifications that are used in the model do still make it quite useful for depths that navies and commercial operators and scientific vessels will mostly be using. So down to the first 1,000 or 2,000 meters in the ocean. And
I was going to say that, Reese. Sorry to jump in, but at what depth do submarines operate? I'm not a Navy person, but wouldn't you think it would be with those sorts of depths, would it?
Yeah, so capturing the first 1 or 2 kilometers of the ocean is absolutely overkill for the depths that we'd be concerned with for modern submarines. Perhaps that'll change in the future with unmanned platforms that might be able to go much, much deeper. But yeah, modern submarines certainly aren't going much deeper than the first, half kilometer of the ocean.
Yeah.
Now, there are some propagation behaviors of sound that aren't captured by the simulator because these just won't be affected by climate change, so I didn't include them. That includes things like absorption by the seafloor, but not including these doesn't really materially affect the result. But if they had been included, then we could perhaps develop a better understanding of what these changes would actually mean in shallow coastal areas.
Yeah, thanks, Reece. And you've mentioned as well, I suppose, the applicability or the sort of, where the model can best, or the simulation can best be applied, open ocean, coastal areas, depths and so forth. And you've hinted at sort of that, I guess, that variation across latitude. But considering the limitations in simulating polar conditions, do you believe, or, you have any insights into the actual effects of climate change on hydroacoustics, especially at polar latitudes, that they actually might be more significant than your study suggests? And I know you were hinting at that earlier, but it'd be good to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's more significant than what my study suggests. So when I first selected data from the IPCC, there were some papers coming out that were outlining climate change is happening faster than expected, or the effects are worse than expected, or XYZ is hotter than expected. The IPCC has a few options to choose from when you go to them to get data for climate science. And I guess in a way, it's almost like choosing how pessimistic you want to be about climate projections. At the time when I first began this research, headlines just filled with terms like that, like faster than expected. We're getting picked up all the time and appearing all over the place in scientific literature. So I decided on their worst case scenario, basically, RPC 8.5. And basically what it means is no significant action has been taken to curtail climate change. Unfortunately, we remain on track for that. And I think it's becoming even more evident that we may actually be on track for a worse than worst case scenario. I don't have a background in oceanography, so I certainly, or climate science, I should say. I certainly didn't want to be saying, these climate scientists have maybe simplified their model too much. But something I did find, which I think has really probably affected the results of my own research, is that the IPCC's models don't include feedback loops. And a feedback loop is basically some symptom of climate change or some consequence of climate change that then itself leads to more climate change. An example is permafrost. In some places, permafrost is rich with methane bubbles. And when that frost melts, that methane is released into the atmosphere, which further warms it, which melts more ice, which may again contain more methane. So their models don't capture that at all because that's just a very difficult thing to capture. So I think it makes it really quite hard to get an accurate picture. But what I would like to see is deeper analysis by oceanographers and climate scientists on how the Arctic Oceans are going to warm on our current track. I think this could be a really big deal in the future for naval operations, especially moving forward. We may even see an ice-free North Pole quite soon.
Yeah, thanks, Reece. And that's that's something you've been talking about for a long time, haven't they? That sort of that ice-free Arctic summer. Yeah, thanks for touching in more depth on the models, the IPCC models that they work with, and the representative concentration pathways and 8.5. Being that worst case scenario, but seemingly, as you point out, we seem to be tracking, constantly on that arc, which is pretty disappointing. So yeah, thanks for unpacking that a little bit more for us today. You were touching on there at the end, and to also circle back to some of the conversation we were having at the beginning, beyond those theoretical aspects and the technical aspects of your research, Reece, how do you foresee the practical applications of your findings? I guess, we mentioned earlier naval operations, marine wildlife, subsea stealth technologies. Be good to sort of, just get a little bit more insights on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I actually touched on in an article I wrote for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And what I wrote there was, I think that militaries and defense firms around the world need to consider this immediately. So while my findings are for the year 2100, every year we get closer to 2100 is bringing us closer to these figures. And the life cycle of a modern nuclear submarine is almost 50 years long. So by the time the AUKUS class, our future class of submarines that Australia and the UK will jointly design and operate, by the time these are in the water and completing sea trials, we'll already be more than halfway to the future of a very, very loud ocean. So this means that these findings need to be considered immediately, not just by AUKUS, but by any nation building either submarines or anti-submarine platforms. And it could mean that there is possibly an immediate rethink required on what sonars these platforms will be equipped with, and possibly new solutions for signal processing, especially considering that there may be a very, very high level of background noise, and we may need new algorithms, perhaps augmented with machine learning, to actually sort signals from those background noises. And it could also mean that we need to rethink the materials that the acoustic dampening and echoic plating is made out of. So there's really a lot of things to think about on the engineering side for defense technology. As far as marine wildlife goes, that's definitely a difficult one to answer. This needs to be considered by lawmakers. We already see negative effects on marine mammals due to sonar operation. Beached whales around the world, in many cases, that's been traced back to sonar operation. And the Navy, at least the Royal Australian Navy, already takes measures to protect wildlife during exercises. But these measures may potentially need to be rethought and possibly expanded because they may not be fit for purpose when sound travels much further than it once did.
Yeah, thanks, Rhys. Really good point you make about the AUKUS submarine. As you correctly point out, the length of time, not only to get into service, but then whilst they're in service, that's really relevant. And the point that you make about thinking about that now, getting that into the capability managers and the design, right at that front end. So, thanks for describing that. And I suppose as well, Rhys, as someone who's done research in this field, what kind of actions or further studies do you sort of believe are necessary to deepen our understanding of the complex interactions between climate change and ocean hydroacoustics?
I've been asked this a lot since the conference, and I've put a fair bit of thought into it by now. But fundamentally, I'm an engineer, not a scientist. So I view my contribution as having been I've demonstrated there is definitely a problem, and now I would like scientists to look into this further and say with a much higher fidelity than I've been able to how bad the problem is. So I guess if I were a scientist and I had unlimited funding and a team of people to work on this with me, I imagine that funding would probably be going towards accessing supercompute time. So I think a study where all of the Argo platform data across the entire world for the last 10 years is examined with automatic quality assurance to discard that junk data I talked about, and perhaps also increasing the resolution of the simulator from being, instead of 1 meter squared chunks of the ocean, to perhaps 1 centimeter squared. I think it would provide a much more accurate picture than I've been able to provide.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. You could also imagine a scenario where they've just got more real-world data as well by getting, sensors through the columns of the ocean in a lot more sort of, I guess, like diverse locations as well would be another, potential opportunity. But of course, as you say, all comes back to budget and, funding, that sort of research. So, but there's some really good suggestions. So, appreciate your thoughts there. Just as well, the paper itself, where can people access and find your paper, Rhys? Is it available online? Or you mentioned the ASPE article that you've written that probably provides a bit of a highlight. That might be something that we can point the listeners to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper itself was available to attendees of the Indo-Pacific Maritime Conference. So if you had a paid ticket to that, you can access that on the website. If you couldn't make it to that, you can access it via Adroita's website. So the URL for that is info.adroita.com.au/Rhys-Kissel. So you can find it there. As for the ASPE article, you can find that if you just Google the headline, "New study suggests climate change will make submarine warfare more complex." And the ASPE strategist article should be the first result.
Yeah, fantastic. And just for, I suppose, listeners that may not be familiar with the ASPE acronym, that's the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, located in Canberra. And yeah, as Rhys rightly said, if you go to ASPE's website and even type in Rhys Kissel as author, Rhys's paper will come up. So Rhys, thanks so much for your time today. We've really appreciated unpacking that with you, and yeah, really interesting work. There's a lot more to be done in this space, but you sound like the person that's opened the can. So well done on that, and we're looking forward to learning more on this in the future.
Thanks very much, Michael. Yeah, in terms of opening the can of worms, I've been thinking maybe I'll even look at how climate change is going to affect the atmosphere and whether that means anything for radar operators in the future. I think there's a lot of knock-on effects from climate change that just really haven't been thought about yet.
Yeah, great chatting to you today, Rhys. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Michael.